All right. Well, it looks Thank you all for joining us for today's session on 3 strategies for working towards financial equity and inclusion. My name is Gabrielle. I'm the Senior Social Media Manager here at DailyPay, and today we're going to take a deeper dive into financial equity and inclusion and talk about some tools that companies can leverage to create more holistic DE&I strategies. I'm thrilled to be joined today by DailyPay's Chief Human Resources Officer, Irene Hendricks, and Michelle Katz, our Head of Talent, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, which encompasses all things related to talent acquisition and development and ensures diversity, equity, and inclusion are weaved in throughout the entire employee experience. So let's hop right in. Company leaders have realized the integral role they play in creating an equitable workplace. In doing so, they're helping their employees become more conscious citizens and really create a more positive impact on the world at large. But there's a lot of work to be done still. Enabling the financial well-being of all employees is a critical piece of the DE&I puzzle that's often overlooked. Real progress can only be made when we address every part of this equation. So before we begin our discussion, we thought it'd be helpful to provide some definitions and statistics. Financial equity and inclusion can be defined as equal access to financial services and professional opportunities. It can also refer to implementing mechanisms that help narrow systemic wealth gaps. So let's put some numbers to this. According to the Federal Reserve, in 2019, the median household income for white families in the US was approximately $188,000, while the median household for Black families was $24,000 and $36,000 for Hispanic and Latin families. And this gap has only widened during the pandemic. So we're beginning to see some change in the right direction. Between 2016 and 2019, median wealth rose more rapidly for Black and Hispanic families at a rate of 33% and 65% respectively, versus wealth increases for all families at a rate of 8%. While this is progress, it's definitely still going to take a lot of work to undo centuries of economic exclusion. And we know the pandemic has only challenged families in numerous ways, from loss of income to pay reductions. Lower income and Black adults have disproportionately had to take on debt or put off paying bills in order to balance their expenses. So with all that said, let's talk about what forward-thinking employers can do to better support their workforces. But before we dive into some questions, I want to remind you all to comment in the PDF section if you'd like to receive our one-page guide. And also, we're doing a giveaway. Just click the link in the caption to enter to win an $150 gift card. So let's hop right in. Starting with you, Michelle, I'd love to, talk some more about what financial equity inclusion is and what companies can do to support their employees.
Sure. So, I think it might be helpful to first ground everyone in why diversity, equity, and inclusion are actually important focus areas for organizations and why it's worthwhile for companies to pay attention to DE&I. So when we think about the world of diversity, equity, and inclusion, there are a number of areas in which companies can play a role within the 4 walls of their organization, obviously. They can create, equitable processes, practices with respect to hiring, developing, promoting their talent, and that's a very good baseline. But they could also work to create an inclusive culture, which is open to different perspectives and backgrounds, like the next level up. And part of what helps to create that greater sense of inclusion internally is when you understand the lived experiences of others and you understand that those experiences can be impactful for those people and emotional for those people, even if those experiences don't hold the same meaning for you. And that's where companies can work to expand education in areas of inclusion, such as hosting a courageous conversation. That can help move people from general awareness straight through to ownership. And that's being done at really the macro level. But there's also things that companies can do at the micro level, such as upskilling managers on leading inclusive teams and what inclusive team meetings actually look like. So ultimately, you want to create a culture where people demonstrate behaviors that foster inclusion. There was a recent McKinsey global survey that found that respondents who felt included in their organizations were nearly 3 times more likely than their peers to feel excited by and committed to their organizations. So you can see how important inclusion is to engagement and retention also. But the question that you're asking is actually about financial equity and inclusion, right? That's like another subset. And that also impacts the employee well-being, but it impacts the employee's well-being kind of outside the 4 walls of the office place. And it's an area that really until recently, most companies didn't realize that they could impact in a consistent and meaningful way. So you had mentioned a definition earlier in terms of financial equity and inclusion about enabling people to have access to, useful and affordable financial products and services in a way that meets their needs, right? So we're talking about things like transactions and payments and savings and credit and insurance and all of those things delivered in a way that's easy to digest, right? That's responsible and easy for people to access. So going back to some of the information, you shared in your introduction, because I think there's a lot of connections here in terms of we have an opportunity to create a far more fair pathway to accumulating wealth and overcoming the inequities that you spoke about in terms of accessing financial institutions, which is really, almost foundational to financial equity and inclusion. So we have the opportunity as organizations to really help to break down barriers for marginalized communities and help those that have been disproportionately impacted by societal norms that have established year over year. So Daily Pay is, I think, a really good example of that because we partner with companies to enable their employees to access their earned income before payday. So inclusion and equity were really at the forefront of our minds in terms of designing the platform. Let me give you an example. So the Daily Pay benefit can be accessed by people who are banked as well as those who are unbanked. People can get their wages by direct deposit or pay card or cash cards. There's multiple ways. So we're meeting them where they're at. And it's enabled by desktop, mobile, SMS. So again, meeting people where they're at. And all of that is really designed to make sure that people can access their income when they need it so that they don't have to wait until payday. We've heard these great stories from people about how because of Daily Pay, they were able to put gas in their car to get to work, or give their kids lunch money, or pay their rent on time and not have to be penalized for a late payment. Access to income gives you choices and choices provide opportunity. And that's an important way that companies can act to provide greater financial inclusion for their employees. You think about the current environment, you spoke about this as part of your introduction with the pandemic and the impact that it's having on the financial well-being of people really across the globe. It's more important than ever, I would say, for companies to align with the needs of their employees. There was a Pew Research Center study that came out, and it was a survey, and it found that half of working adults said that the economic impact of the coronavirus outbreak is going to make it harder for them to achieve their long-term goals. So it was something around like 44%. So that's almost half. Think that it's going to take them 3 years or more to get back to where they were a year ago. So, when you think about that, there's an expression of employees should bring their whole selves to work. We can flip that and say that companies need to consider the whole selves of their employees in designing equitable and inclusive programs and benefits packages that impact their employees inside and outside of the workplace and help them get from point A to point B.
Wow. Thank you, Michelle. That was really informative and definitely.
There's a lot packed in there, I realize. It was a simple question and I had much to share.
No, that was wonderful. And I think that was a great segue into my next question for Irene, talking about how does this issue affect company culture in the world at large? So Irene, I'll go ahead and pass it off to you. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I think, building on what Michelle said, no company exists as an island. No company exists separately from these global forces and societal forces that we see going on, frankly. And so when you think about this very focused concept of financial equity and inclusion, it absolutely affects company culture because it's inextricably linked to how our colleagues make choices and have opportunities. So I've spent a lot of time in the financial services industry, and one thing that we're starting to hear more about is people who are underbanked or underserved by traditional financial institutions. So a bank account is a great example. It's a gateway to other financial services. It's a way for people to save. It helps both on day-to-day expenses and financial management, but also the choices that are available to families in the short and the long term. both in terms of wealth creation, strategic financial choices, but also just short-term unexpected emergencies. And so there's this sense of psychological safety and well-being that comes from knowing that you have tools available to meet both those short and long-term financial needs. And so as we think about how we bring this into a company, financial inclusion can create amazing experiences for employees in the company. So if we bring it down to like a very simple example, so in the post-pandemic world or visualize back to the pre-pandemic world, a group of colleagues are chatting in a hallway and decide to go to lunch. And they say, hey, let's go to this restaurant down the street and get lunch together. And you may have different experiences within that group of 4 or 5 colleagues talking about getting lunch. Some colleagues may mentally say, yeah, sure, that's going to cost about X dollars and not a problem, and I'm going to go. And then people who may be in a different financial circumstance may say, that's really not for me. I'm either going to skip lunch or, eat something that I've brought from home, because financially, and you can visualize yourself doing this, we're all running through that mental math of, is this affordable? Is this not affordable? And if I don't have cash in my wallet or access to a payment instrument, whether it's a debit card, a credit card, Apple Pay, whatever the case may be, how will I navigate what potentially could be an awkward situation? And so when you take that to its next logical extent, that unbanked or underserved individual who doesn't have access to liquidity and their money might sit there and say, you know what, I'm going to have to pass on this. And so longer term, there's relationships that form at that lunch. There are topics that come up that individual may not be included in, not because anybody had bad intent, but simply because it was not an experience that they could partake of. And so when we think about how disparities start in terms of opportunity, they can start with something that small as people taking 45 minutes to grab lunch together. And then it sort of spirals out to the long-term cultural impact within the workplace of financial inclusion. And so then if I think a little bit broader about society in general, there was an interesting McKinsey study a couple months ago that really talked about the importance of accelerating financial inclusion. They chose to focus in particular on Black communities. And they talked about how the average American Black family has a lower wealth asset, about 1/10 of an average white American family. And this gap can leave a lot of Black families at disadvantage in the aggregate to fully participate in the economy. They're underrepresented in these traditional financial services products and institutions. And it's not just a symptom of the racial wealth gap, although it certainly is that, but there's also like a spiraling cause to that, which is interesting to read about, but it also is a challenge and an opportunity and frankly a call to action for us to support everyone in creating wealth today, but also generational wealth that transfers to the future.
All right. Well, thanks, Irene. That was really eye-opening. So, Michelle, I want you to expound on this a bit more, and then we'll bring it back over to Irene. What are some steps do you think in the workplace and beyond that can be taken in order to bridge some of these gaps?
That's a great question. I think as a society globally, we have an opportunity to make financial inclusion more of a priority. And that means supporting the creation of financial inclusion mechanisms that can support the generational wealth building and wealth transfer that Irene was referencing. And that's going to help elevate society as a whole, right? Closing that wealth gap is going to provide opportunity and choice across the board. So it in essence, levels the playing field. And it in doing so, it helps to mitigate unconscious biases and stereotypes that may have that people may have about certain groups and their ability to succeed. Irene mentioned the article, the McKinsey article, and building on that, if you see that there's a group of people who perhaps aren't participating as much, you may make inferences around why that is. And some of that may end up leading you to think certain things about people's ability to succeed or be successful, or categorize an entire group of people accordingly. So, there really needs to be a very conscious strategy on the part of organizations to bring diversity, equity, and inclusion to the forefront of their business agenda. Because it means not only identifying and acknowledging the pay gap, and you can conduct pay equity analyses within the organization, and then take steps to putting a plan in place to close that gap over time. This isn't going to happen overnight. It's not a flip the switch and instantaneously it happens. But if the right steps are put in place and it's a very, methodical framework, I think it can be corrected in a short time frame. Now, this is actually an important step in terms of elevating society as a whole and closing that. If you think about women play a vital role in household and family finances. And there's a tremendous potential for positive economic impact and growth as we ensure that there's greater equity in their pay. And that's across the board. I would say also the last thing that's important to mention here really goes back to what we were speaking about earlier, and the fact that creating a culture of inclusion within an organization is really important. And companies that support education and dialogue to bridge the understanding of lived experiences of others, they're going to be vital to advancing the equity and inclusion in that workplace. So teaching us how to be culturally sensitive to others and extending ourselves to offer support, mentorship, allyship, will all be an important part of this journey of closing the gap, because I think it's really multifaceted. It's not just one thing that you do.
Yeah, I agree 100%. Irene, I'd love to hear what you think. What do you think company leaders can do to help close these gaps in the workplace and beyond?
Yeah, so I think in this conversation, we've talked a lot about what companies can do holistically, and the offerings and the programs and the practices, frankly, all of these travel together. And if I hone in specifically on some of the programs and benefits that companies can offer, I think we're all really proud at Daily Pay of the product that we've innovated in terms of on-demand pay and letting colleagues access their earned wages before payday. So it helps with those short-term challenges, whether it's paying bills, engaging in that lunch meeting that we talked about before, or meeting emergency expenses for their family with a sense of confidence and a sense of really stress reduction in what frankly is a very, very stressful time kind of across the world, right? And then, when I think about macro and micro work that organizations can do and that leaders can do, it's waking up every day with inclusion at the forefront. And so there's foundational work, making sure that all voices are heard at the table, reaching out to the colleague who may not have made a comment or may not have engaged in a particular conversation, and then taking those small stage moments to a bigger stage, like public advocacy for those who are underrepresented in marginalized communities. As leaders, we all set the tone at the top, really, for what's considered acceptable, what our norms are within an organization, and some of the choices that we make, both in terms of the way we show up and the things that we do on company strategy, like benefits packages, like formal DE&I initiatives. Those really shape the culture for years to come. One thing I know we're very proud of at Daily Pay, and it's a best practice that exists in a lot of leading organizations, are employee resource groups. A great way for colleagues in a variety of groups to come together, to form relationships across the organization, but also for leaders to show up for these colleagues. And shape agendas that are really meaningful to the members of the employee resource groups. We're proud to have 4 of those at Daily Pay with executive sponsors who really get engaged with those groups and really help support them, tear down barriers, and drive inclusion with those ERGs is a really big part of the strategy. Another thing that I think is a real best practice is, Heritage Months and cultural touchstones and meaningful moments like Juneteenth. So there's opportunities there for education, there's opportunities for service, and there's opportunities to create a culture across the whole organization. So thinking about diverse holidays or observances, cultural observances, the colleagues of different faith backgrounds, different ethnic backgrounds, and really incorporating those into the corporate culture and the corporate calendar. Thinking about how to minimize those conflicts and be sensitive to not just those that align with your own belief system, but those that might align with colleagues across the organization. So very simple way to do that is a corporate calendar where you actually lay out some of those key milestones and say, okay, this is not a day for an all hands meeting. This is not the day for an impactful strategic press release. Things of that nature shows that you are walking in the shoes of others and recognizing their priorities as your priorities. Another thing Michelle talked a little bit about before that I want to amplify is courageous conversations. And so they're a way to have really important dialogues about the lived experiences of others. So we hear a lot the concept of do the work. And a big part of do the work is reach out and say, I don't know, tell me, share with me. But do it in a way that's authentic, do it in a way that's not rushed, do it in a way that's meaningful. And this is really an opportunity just to invite people to be heard and to open a conversation that maybe will never close, but that keeps the door open going forward. So as a leader, it's really about how you show up as an ally, how you become a confidant to people who may be different than yourself, and how you can champion a diverse variety of interests within your workplace. And so, this is an evolution as companies evolve their culture. So it's everything from, if you're a first line supervisor, how do you care for your team and how do you show up for your team? As you grow within your career, how do you shape things at a departmental level, at an organizational level? Those same foundational principles of reaching out, of listening, of being an ally, of keeping an open channel of communication, just continue to spiral up on a broader stage. So everyone's really got a role to play here. And, certainly I think HR and people functions across the world have an important part in this agenda, but I would encourage that not to be limited just to the HR and people functions. There's certainly great work that can be done there, but the partnership with people who are frontline supervisors is absolutely essential.
And one of the things that Irene mentioned that I just want to elaborate on, we recently had these all hands inclusion meetings, which not only set a baseline with respect to terminology within the organization, but it also spoke about tactics in terms of how to engage outside of your comfort zone. So, and it really spoke about it from two sides of things, not only with respect to the organizations that the people who may want to ask questions outside of their comfort zone of others, but it's also if you are on the receiving end of questions, how can you be open to that? How can you calmly share what your lived experiences are so that people understand what it's like living in your shoes? And really the onus is in part on all of us in terms of how we create the environment and the culture that we want to have within an organization, because culture is based on the interactions that you have with others around you. And so, this is just an important part of our journey as an organization in terms of this space as well.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Basically ensuring that inclusion and equity is embedded in everything we do is so crucial to just moving forward and creating positive impacts, across the organization, but on the world at large. So thank you both. It looks like we're running up on our time. So I want to thank everyone again for joining us today. We hope this discussion gave you some new insights and actionable takeaways. And before we sign off, I also want to remind you all to comment PDF in the comment section if you'd like to receive a one-page guide on our 3 strategies for working towards equity inclusion. And also, if you click the link in the caption, you'll be entered to win an $150 gift card. So make sure you do that as well. So thanks again, everyone. Thank you, Michelle and Irene, for being a part of this very important conversation. And that's all we have for today. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gabrielle. Thank you, Michelle. Really appreciate your partnership.
Thanks,